right, so this is Chris Thiede, managing editor of ComArch, and I'm here with David Katz with Katz Architecture. I guess, David, before we start, if you could kind of tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously, we have your name. Tell us about your title and your firm and the kind of work that you do.
Sure. My name is David Katz, as you mentioned. I'm the founder of Katz Architecture. We've been around since 2002, and we're a full-service practice with a primary specialization in renovation, restoration, preservation, and maintenance of pre-war historic structures. We work in a large range of scales on residential, cultural, commercial project types. Some of our current projects include the renovation of a theater for El Museo del Barrio, which is a magnificent museum up on the top of Museum Mile in New York City. We're now working on the restoration of the building where that is located. We're doing a couple restorations in facades and roofs and buildings in Soho. A number of residential projects, and actually a couple of new buildings, which is very exciting for us. And one of them is actually a new shared office workspace building down in Soho, which we're in the process of running through the local historic preservation commission here.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you for that introduction. So what we want to talk with you today about is something that's on a lot of people's minds, and as it relates to workspaces and architecture and so forth, and that is, what is the world going to look like? What is the built environment going to look like moving forward as we deal with the COVID pandemic and hopefully kind of emerge from it? But before we kind of get into the details of what we're doing now, I guess talk a little bit about the big picture in terms of, the built environment has kind of always been there, and different diseases and things have happened to humanity throughout history. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the built environment has changed over time in reaction to some of those types of world events.
Sure. Before I get into that, I just want to say, how this whole thing came about, because how our investigations came about, because we found ourselves as an architectural office at the end of March in a position where there was not a lot of work going on. Of course, a lot of the projects that we had were kind of put on pause. Some of them were stopped altogether. And we were seeing around us what was an unprecedented transformation in the way people were experiencing architecture and experiencing space. And at the same time, we found that, personally, I wanted to feel like a useful member of society without a lot of this work going on that we normally did. I mean, everything we were doing just seemed so much less important compared to the impact of the pandemic. So we embarked on a series of investigations, which we titled Post-Pandemic Architecture. And we, as a group, looked at a variety of things that we felt were going to be very much impacted by the effects of the pandemic. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but we put together a list of a lot of things. And then individually, we decided what areas were of most interest to us. And we looked at the grocery store, because as we all know, the grocery store changed dramatically. We looked at the mobile business and how the mobile business it could potentially become much more important in an environment where people are not traveling as much and where businesses need to come to the individual. We looked at the urban green space, which, as we all know, became much more significant in our lives because we were spending much more time in parks and things like that. And then finally, and then we looked at the healthy building. What was it that made a building healthy? What were the things that made a building unhealthy? And what would happen as people started to go back to work? And then finally, we looked at the topic that we're discussing today, which is the live-work option, which we all know is something which is really happening and really critical to the way we're all working, with the huge percentage of people now working from home. So anyway, with that as an intro, I just wanted to say that, you know, throughout history, there have been political, religious, and psychological reactions to infectious disease. In the absence of a vaccine, the spread of disease is addressed through isolation and quarantine, which are very specifically architectural ideas. So the question is, how does an infectious disease transform the built environment? And we all know that there's a lot of examples of this. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, and I'm going to talk about New York City. In New York City, in the 19th century, you had a place where none of the streets were paved. The primary means, or the sole means of transportation, was the horse. There was a lack of a public sewage system. There was all the associated waste with all of these horses all over the city. If a horse died in the street, it would just be left there and you know, to rot away. If there were any drinking fountains, they were shared, where people literally shared drinking cups and things like that. And in addition to that, there was massive migration to the city. The population increased by something like 50 times between 1800 and 1900. And all these horrible, unsanitary conditions led to a lot of disease. And in one particular example, there was a cholera outbreak around 1830. There were something like 5,000 deaths over the course of 3 months due to the lack of clean water, which may not seem like a lot by today's standards, but at the time, you could imagine it was a huge percentage of the population. That, in conjunction with some other things, led to the beginning, or the start of work on the Croton Aqueduct, which eventually led to indoor plumbing. And that was an unheard of luxury at the time. So by the end of the 19th century, you start seeing indoor plumbing and much more sanitary conditions. Likewise, you see there was a tuberculosis outbreak. It was a leading cause of death in the US in the 1800s. Sufferers were moved to areas where there was dry air and where people could take in light and air. In fact, there were a number of camps that were set up in Colorado, and it led in large part to the settling of that area, in addition to the bringing of tuberculosis out west. But back east, there was a sanatorium up in the Adirondack Mountains. It was called the Saranac Lake Sanatorium, excuse me. And they utilized these rooms called cure porches. And the cure porches were in front of the building, as a porch would be. It allowed people to sit, take in the light and the air. And from that point forward, the idea of a sunroom or a cure porch worked its way into the lexicon of residential architectural vocabulary. So there are many other examples. I mean, just thinking about in terms of interior finishes. Around the same time period, there was a restaurant. It was one of the first national dining chains. It was started by two brothers in the 1880s. It was called Child's Restaurant. You know, and partly as a consequence of all this disease that was going on, there was an unusually high emphasis on cleanliness and hygiene. All the surfaces were clean and white, and they used for the first time what we know today as white subway tile, which we associate with cleanliness. And the waiters, prior to this, it was only men who waited on tables. In this case, they brought women in, and the women were dressed in crisp white uniforms to be almost nurse-like. And this was very appealing. And this restaurant actually did extraordinarily well into the 20s and 30s. And then lastly, as another example, as a consequence of these diseases of the 19th century, and then in the beginning of the 20th century, of course, the major flu epidemic of 1918, where you have 50 million people dying around the world, that is what, it was one of the reasons why we had the birth of modern architecture. Modern architecture, compared to what came before it, had these pristine, clean lines, hygienic white surfaces. There was a lack of ornamentation, so there was a lack of dust, lots of light, air, and glass. And if you look at one of the first truly modern house, which was Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, you can see the building that's raised up above the ground, you know, above the dirt. It's got these clean white surfaces, light and views. It operates like a functional machine, as he proposed for all his buildings. But what's most interesting, if you look at a photo now, if you look at the entry to that building, there's actually a sink in the entry. So he was thinking about purification way back then, and it's not unlike what we're thinking about now. And in fact, I believe that the mudroom, or some type of mudroom, will become you know, a very big part of all new programs now, where people want to disinfect and purify before coming into their homes. So anyway, that was a long answer to a short question.
No, those are some great examples. So, I mean, you mentioned that you kind of set out on this investigative process, and you talked a little bit about that. I guess talk a little bit about, you know, what you found as it relates to, you know, the current situation and how living and working spaces, you know, might be affected in the future, or might change in the.
Well, you know, as the COVID-19 pandemic has forced a large percentage of the professional population, it's important to make that clear, it's a professional population, to work from home, many people have realized, and many companies have realized, that a remote office setup can and should be a long-term option. I mean, this is the time to seriously investigate how that option can be put into practice, because, you know, people historically have commuted to office space. As you know, up until March, everyone was doing that, and now you have a situation where transportation is a danger, and where things like elevators are a potential danger. So the idea that people can work from home is a very appealing notion. And you have large companies, something like I read recently that Google was talking about keeping 200,000 of their employees working from home after the pandemic, and that Facebook is talking about 50% of their employees. I mean, that's a huge number of people, and I think that there is a desire to sort of build communities around one's home, to sort of create a kind of microeconomy, if you will, or a number of these micro areas where people can work and live. And you know, there's a variety of examples of the way people have, you know, historical examples of the way people have lived and worked under the same roof. I mean, don't forget, up until the latter part of the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, everyone really worked and lived in the same location. One of the earlier examples is the machiya in Japan, which is a building type in which there was a space in the front of the building that was separated from the street itself by a lattice screen, and those screens could be opened up during the day, so that space in front of the building could open onto the street. And then at night, the screen was closed, and they used a series of opaque surfaces to convert that space back to the house. So it was absorbed back to the house in the evening. It's a first example, or the first obvious example, I think, of a flex space. There are other examples, the medieval longhouse, which was basically where you had a barn on one side of a long building separated by a perpendicular passage, and on the other side there was a hall and then living quarters. In the 17th and 18th century, there were examples of homes with what we refer to as a top shop, where there was spaces above with large windows, and that would be for people that required a lot of natural light, like for things like craft work, like lace making and weaving and watchmaking and so forth. And then of course you have the from the 18th century before and forward, and even you see today examples of having a shop on the ground floor and then a building above. It used to be that the shop belonged to the person who lived above. That's no longer the case. But those laws have sort of carried over. So you have a commercial that's allowed on the ground floor but not above. I think almost out of habit. But obviously, during the Industrial Revolution, what happened is with rapid urbanization and overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, noise, large factories, and disease, people moved. People decided that it was necessary to separate these things out. Specifically, the politicians and the just as a matter of safety, decided that it was necessary to zone the city. And this is what gave rise to what we refer to as functional zoning, which started in the early 20th century. So in functional zoning, and zoning, as we all know, happens in every city, but and there are positive things about it, don't misunderstand me, but it's also limiting, particularly with regard to this example we're talking about. So with functional zoning, you have areas that are dedicated to residential use, areas that are dedicated to commercial use, and areas that are dedicated to industrial use. And these things cross over only in very specific cases. But you have areas, and naturally you don't want heavy industry in an area where people are going to be living. Commercial you can have to some degree, but with minor exception, the idea of a live-work model after functional zoning came into being was put on hold for 100 years. There are a few examples of this. Le Corbusier again did a building in Marseille, Unité Habitation, which was a large building, again raised up off the ground, but it was a large multi-use building, if you will, with a couple of essentially streets as within the center of the building that allowed for retail and restaurants and gymnasiums and so forth. That's probably one of the most notable examples. Another major example happened in New York, and this was a bellwether for the whole live-work idea and had led to a lot of adaptive reuse throughout the country, and that is Soho in the 1970s. And Soho in New York in the late 60s, early 70s was an abandoned manufacturing area, light manufacturing area for the most part, and it was about the time when artists were looking for space that was inexpensive and large enough to produce large paintings and sculptures. And they found that space in this area of New York called Soho, despite the fact that Robert Moses wanted to pave it and turn it into a highway, but it ended up lasting, right? Good for us. So but Soho was inhabited by these artists where they could work. Now, there were problems with being in a manufacturing district. There were no kitchens, there were no adequate bathrooms, there's not adequate fire protection and so forth. And as a result, the fire department started coming in and evicting these artists. Eventually, there was a movement to designate artists as artists in residence, which gave them some protection. And then in 1982, there was a loft law that came into being that protected them entirely against eviction. And from that point forward, there were discussions about how you could turn a manufacturing district into a residential district. But problems still exist, because the live work, there's plenty of live work regulations. I mean, there's no national legislation right now. There's different fire codes for different uses, which means that wall and ceiling construction is affected, the paths of egress are affected, sprinkler requirements are affected. And even though there are some cities that have taken steps, like in California, I think Berkeley and Oakland, I know I saw a project by Olson Sundberg in Seattle, which is very nice. I saw something in Philadelphia. New York City, of course, allows some residential use in commercial zones, but for the most part, there's not really, there's not a lot of movement in that regard. And now is really the time to investigate these things. I mean, there's no question these pressures that exist where it's now virtually, you know, impossible to inhabit the office the way we were, you know? So, you know, and there's clearly advantages to live work. I mean, it's family friendly for one thing. You know, you get to spend time with people you love. It gives you a great deal of flexibility. There's a savings on, you know, dramatic savings on overhead. There's time savings not having to commute, and of course, it lowers the carbon footprint because there's less travel. It encourages 24-hour occupation of neighborhoods, which is, you know, naturally a major advantage. So you have areas that are dark at night or not used during the day, and this pales in terms. I mean, there's likewise there are arguments against it, right? You have distractions at home. If you want to put on the TV, you could. Not that, you know, I don't know a lot of people that are watching their favorite soap operas during the day these days. There's a tendency to overwork for those of us that are, you know, workaholics. There's a lack of a separation between work and home, and there's, you know, potential, you know, social isolation. But really the biggest disadvantage is that it's not promoted or allowed by zoning. So really we're in a position where there needs to be movement. There needs to be people that take this on, community leaders that are able to make the change in the laws that allow for having live work in a variety of locations.
So that's really interesting. I mean, you gave a lot of great examples kind of leading up to the current state of things and the need for, you know, these types of spaces. I guess talk a little bit about the concept that you and your team have come up with in terms of this new live/work space. You know, what does it involve? You know, what are some of the design concepts that you kind of envision with this type of space?
Sure. Well, we're viewing this as a way to re-energize cities in a sense, because, and when I say that, I'm using that in a very loose term, right? Because we see that there's people now leaving the city. So we do see this as a kind of urban model in a sense. And while we develop something which is relatively small scale, potentially this could be something somewhat larger scale. But the idea is that there are various ways that work can occur within close proximity to the home, because this is all about a sense of security and cleanliness. If you think about during the pandemic, you might be very safe in your home, and you may be safe in your garden, even if there's a communal garden. You're not safe going to the supermarket. You're not safe going into the subway. So the idea is, how can you create these environments that create a different model that create different areas of safety? So what we came up with was a building in which there are 3 different types of workspace, and it's effectively a community. So at the ground floor of our building, we have a series of retail spaces, not unlike what you would find in a typical building now. The way it differs is that within each one of the apartments that we've created, each apartment is a duplex unit. So you have one floor, and then you have a secondary floor, which is what we refer to as a flex space. And that flex space could be used as an office during the day, or it could be used as a second bedroom at night, but it's a way to add more space to the home to allow for office space. And it also allowed us a way to geometrically combine these units so that we could reduce the number of hallways going through the building. And then there's a third type of office space that we've introduced, which is an independent office on alternate floors within the building so that it could be used either by people within the building itself, outside the home, or it could be used by people who might come in from the neighborhood and from the, from the community. And then in addition to that, we have created a garden level on the roof, because it's the whole idea of community has become much more important now. Like in my area, people are spending much more time together. You get to know your neighbors a lot more under circumstances like this. And I think that's important because there needs to be a way to share ideas and interact with other people. And I think it's important to create this sense of community.
Okay. So how do you, you mentioned that, spaces like this, I mean, current zoning laws and so forth make it difficult for spaces like this. I mean, what's the way forward? Do you see maybe aspects of this kind of concept being incorporated into existing buildings perhaps, and or perhaps looking at ways that these types of buildings can be either retrofitted or created, moving forward?
Well, I do think that the buildings can be retrofitted. They can always be retrofitted. Again, we're dealing with some fairly high hurdles in that it's not something that's immediately allowable because of zoning laws. So in all likelihood, it's probably something that would succeed much more readily as a new building type, and ostensibly in an area that allows this kind of mixed use area. There's no question that there's a need for visionary developer clients who want to do something special with a piece of property right now. They want to take the risk to address current needs, but these needs definitely exist. There's going to be a shift. It's already, I mean, there's no doubt that what has happened during the pandemic, no doubt to me, that what has happened during the pandemic is going to lead to a shift in populations permanently, or at least in the near future for quite a long time, away from the city center. And you see it already. It's a boon to rural areas and to suburban areas. So how can we re-energize these areas of the city? And the other thing that I should talk about here is equality, because the idea that it's not that not everyone has the capability of working from home. I'm sure it's okay for for white collar workers and for people that are focused on a computer and people that have fast internet capability and so forth. But there are a lot of people that don't have the space, or they don't have the ability to connect, and they are really at a loss. So in a sense, this is a building type, and I realize we're talking, certainly in a city like New York, a type of luxurious building. But I think there are ways to adapt this model to all sorts of housing types. And I think it's very important because we're going to see a cosmic shift in the way that people inhabit cities. And just as a way to maintain this city, I think we have to rethink about the way that we work. And this is absolutely critical, or we're going to start to see, major issues here. I mean, I read today in the Times that New York is looking at something like, a $9 billion shortfall in the next couple of years. And they can't get money from the state because the state is at a $14.5 billion shortfall. So, I think we need to do something internally to kind of develop these places to allow people to continue to work within cities. And it shouldn't be only the white collar workers working at their computers. There should be spaces that allow for retail spaces, for other commercial uses and so forth, to allow people to come in and sort of interact, because the street as we know it The fact that, before you would go to work and you would have a place of work where you'd go to lunch and you would utilize businesses there, that's no longer going to be the case. So we're immediately seeing a kind of breakdown in the types of businesses that are going to survive. So this type of model will allow businesses to succeed, or promote a way for businesses to succeed.
So I mean, so you're really talking about it's more than just providing spaces for people to live and work and so forth, but you're really talking about, I guess, the survival or the vibrance of some of our major cities that are seeing a little bit of an exodus right now, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, listen, I tell you, you could see, when you start looking at real estate prices outside the city, they've skyrocketed in the last several months. And there's a shift away from any of the work. We do a lot of residential work in the city. We've seen a marked shift away from high-end residential work in the city. And this is anecdotal for me, but all my colleagues are feeling the same pressure. And I think what is happening really is, and then in terms of office, I go into my office every once in a while, and I can tell you that offices are empty now. Are they going to remain empty? I don't know. I mean, if a vaccine it comes along tomorrow, it's still going to take a while to put into practice. But I still think the memory of this is going to stay with us. There's a term, the term hysteresis. I found it's the phenomenon in which the value of a physical property lags behind changes in the effect causing it. So in other words, if we've grown used to, it's just, my scientist friends are probably going to tell me I got it wrong, but generally the idea is that it's that we will continue along a path despite the fact that the thing that caused that change doesn't exist anymore. So even when there is a vaccine, I think it'll be embedded in our memory. And then if we look back on recent pandemics, because there were loads of pandemics within the last 30 years that we narrowly escaped, at least here in the United States. But it's quite possible these things will occur more frequently. So I do believe that these changes that we're talking about are going to affect us for decades, at least. I think this is really going to shift things for us.
So why, and this might sound like kind of an obvious question, but why is it so important to, I guess, take this step to ensure that the future and the vibrance and energy of cities like New York and others that are kind of struggling right now?
That's a very good question. But I mean, the fact is that for one thing, because of the millions and millions of people that would be affected, right? And the fact that otherwise we're sort of branching out, and there's a lot of arguments about this. I was reading in the an article in the Atlantic that that one of the consequences of all this is going to be a shift away from major cities into secondary cities that are a little more livable. So there's going to be also a political transformation as well. But I do think that the reason for maintaining urban centers is because there is something that comes out of a large population that is interacting and sharing ideas to sort of move and advance the culture in a very positive, dynamic, intellectual way. And while that can happen to some degree through things like Zoom, I don't think that it's the same. I think that it's very important that as we're human beings and we need social interaction. And I think by separating, the idea of separating people is not a great solution, And I think it's important just by virtue of the fact that there's so many people in the city that are going to suffer if something is not done.
Okay. So where do we go? I mean, you mentioned before that something like this is going to take sort of a visionary and kind of risk-taking developer, right? I mean, what are the next steps, or how does this how does this happen moving forward?
Well, I do think that the discussion, the discussion has already begun.
Okay.
And I think the discussion is very important. I think there are areas that have begun to investigate this. And I think that just on an organic level, you see changes beginning to take place in terms of the way we all inhabit our homes and the way the homes have changed. And I think that there's going to be a natural progression in that regard in terms of residential use of space. But I do think there needs to be a greater discussion among trade groups, among developers, among community leaders to think about how we can move this forward. I don't know if it amounts to proposing grants or a tax structure or tax advantages to people that allow this to happen. But I do think that the discussion has to continue. And I do think that developers are already thinking about this, albeit on a smaller scale, with the idea of, say, residential apartments with amenity spaces like offices and so forth. But I think there needs to be some kind of shift in the thinking that promotes this type of building use. And it might be, you had asked earlier about whether or not this can happen within existing buildings. I think it is going to happen, because I think what's going to happen with the enormous amount of office space in these cities if people don't return to work. I mean, there'll be a huge amount of space. There's going to be a sort of natural shift. I don't know what that is. But I think maybe landlords will keep their spaces vacant, and just wait to see what happens. But I do think there will be a kind of a natural inventive use of space. But I think that does need to be promoted. And I think the discussions need to occur, between architects, urban planners, developers, and politicians and community leaders to make this happen. It's because it's going to happen no matter what. So we might as well really, take the bull by the horns and figure out a way to do it well.
Okay. Great. Well, that feels like a pretty good place to end there. So,
okay.
Thank you very much for your time today. And yeah, it's been a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.